In the summer before last, I set out to construct an authentic Anglo-Saxon pit house using the tools and techniques of the early Anglo-Saxons. In the 7th century, the kings of the USI were expanding their influence in southwest Britain, pressing into Somerset, Dorset and Devon from their royal heartlands in Oxfordshire, and overthrowing the Romano-British kings of Dominion. While the powerful dynasties warred, freeman warriors and farmers took this opportunity to settle new land, at times by force, but also more peacefully, alongside the Romano-British communities now living under a new Anglo-Saxon elite. One of the first structures that may have been built on an Anglo-Saxon farmstead was the pit house, serving first as a place to call home, and later becoming a workshop or storage place. The depth of Saxon pit houses varies, from shallow scrapes of just a few inches to much deeper, even up to 2 feet. I based the pit footprint and post holes of this house on an example from Lechlade-on-Thames, Oxfordshire, 14 foot long by 10 foot wide, with a depth of around 1.5 feet. The pit had a post hole at each end, a long shelf on the southern side, and an opening into the side of the pit, which I interpreted as an entranceway. I also built the house on the same orientation as the original, southwest to northeast. My axe and mattock are based on examples found at Anglo-Saxon sites, such as the Middle Saxon settlement of Flixborough. The carved oak spade is based on images from early medieval manuscripts, alongside those wooden spades found in Viking Age sites, such as the Oseberg ship burial. All that usually remains of these pit houses is the pit itself, the post holes, and sometimes a burnt hearth. To reconstruct this house, all I had to suggest its structure above ground was the size of the pit and the location of the post holes. Everything else had to be archaeologically invisible, meaning that the walls, roof, and everything but the posts needed to use techniques that would not survive in the archaeology. So, I decided to make the walls of wattle, with small posts knocked into the upcast earth around the pit, but no deeper than ground level, so as not to leave post hole marks. The surrounding land is dotted with ancient hazel stalls, which have not been coppiced for many decades, 70 years in some cases. These hazels need regeneration. Cutting them encourages the tree to regrow, and allows you to harvest renewable timber every 7 to 10 years. This means that I have plenty of hazel with which to weave my wattle walls. Weaving the flexible rods of hazel around the posts produces an incredibly strong fence or wall, all held together by the tension of the hazel rods. It is sturdy enough for me to put my whole weight on, and even to stand on it. Looking back, if I were to do this again, I would have used thinner hazel as the weaving rods, up to a maximum of 1 inch diameter. When I first started, my thoughts were the thicker the rods, the stronger the wall, but I found that some of the rods were so thick they forced the upright posts out of position. Thinner rods would have produced a wall as strong and more upright uniform wattle. Wattle gains its strength from each rod combined, not from the individual rods themselves. This is a common theme in early medieval building. Both houses and ships, such as the Suttonby longship, tend to be made of many relatively weak or flexible components, combined into a strong, resilient whole. Hazel is a great building material because it can be woven and bent into almost any conceivable shape, and even twisted into withies for wrapping and lashing. I found it helped to twist and wrap the hazel rods around the posts at the open doorway for extra strength. It wasn't easy finding 2 straight forked poles from the ancient and twisted hazels surrounding my house site, but I was starting to like the idea of building a house entirely from materials within a mile or so from my house, and as I had no straight oak, hazel would have to do. I'm also interested to see just how long hazel, a non-durable wood, will last in a primitive medieval house. I simply carved the ridgepole to fit snugly into the 2 forks of the posts, working on the idea of building this house as simply as possible, as I imagine many new settlers in the past had to start out. charred the base of each forked post before setting it into the post hole. This could potentially help to deter rot and insects. For the ridgepole, I chose a long, slightly curved timber, which I placed with the curve facing upwards, in a style of roof known as hog-backed. This was commonly used in depictions of Anglo-Saxon and later Viking houses. On seeing the flexibility of my hazel rods when twisted, I decided to use hazel withies to lash the rafters to the walls and ridgepole, with small notches for the withy to sit in. Young hazel whips just 2 or 3 years old make good withies and can be twisted until the fibres separate, starting at the top and working down to the base. The base of the whip isn't cut until afterwards, and this helps hold the end in place during twisting. Hazel, along with willow, alder and birch, can be twisted well and produce a flexible, durable, withy rope in much less time than it takes to twist willow bark or linden bast. I lashed the rafters using a roughly square lashing technique, and also used withies to construct a doorway or porch, which would tie in to the rest of the roof. To support the lashings at the wall, I also wove in some more hazel rods into the rafters and wedged them down onto the wall to stop the rafters themselves sliding down. I then carried on weaving rods into the rafters all the way up to the ridgepole. This is stronger than just using purlins, lashed or pegged on top of the rafters, as the interwoven hazel purlins support the rafters as well as vice versa, meaning the whole roof acts as one. This means the relatively thin rafters will support the roof for longer than they might have done without being interwoven. With the roof structure finished, standing in the house started to feel like standing in a tiny woven church, with the light streaming in between the woven roof. With midsummer well past, the meadow was very long, and I started to consider it for thatching the roof. Although dried grass has been used in the past for thatching ricks, it is not an ideal thatching material. It acts more like a sponge, soaking up rainwater rather than shedding it. That said, I wanted to see how grass would work as a base layer of thatching, underneath a weathering coat of something more durable. A base layer of thatch provides a surface for the outer layer of thatching to be fixed into. Anything could be used, from straw to reeds and bracken. Turf could also be laid onto the roof before fixing the thatch with hazel spars. I didn't want to dig up my meadow for turf, and although I had some good bracken nearby, I didn't have enough to thatch the whole roof. So I decided to use dried grass in the name of experimental archaeology, and see if it would be a good alternative to turf. I also felt it would be good to continue relying on local materials and experience the incredibly labour-intensive process of cutting, harvesting and drying thatch. In total, the harvesting, drying and transporting of thatch took 4 times as long as the thatching itself, and really highlighted to me how much of an industry this must have been from the early medieval period all the way up into early 20th century Europe. I secured the grass thatching by laying it in place on the roof and lashing hazel rods across it so that it was held tightly between the rod and the roof purlins. I used tarred flax cordage for this, about 700 feet of it across the whole roof, which again reflects another massive industry and a huge amount of labour had I twisted all the cordage myself by hand. Tying off inside, I really enjoyed seeing the diversity of my meadow immortalised in the inside of my roof, with dried meadowsweet, thistledown, vetch and yarrow giving a beautiful texture against the woven hazel. But as I half expected, it didn't do well in the rain. The grass roof held up against light rain, but a heavy summer storm quickly showed me that I would need to get the weathering coat of thatch on as quickly as possible. This style of thatching is known as directional thatching, where each row of course is placed about halfway up the previous row, overlapping it, and is then tied down with 2 rows of rods per course. This is quite different to the standard traditional way of thatching known today, but is a much quicker style and only takes a few days as opposed to a month or more. I chose to use long straw wheat, which I bought from a farm 15 miles away, as my weathering coat of thatch. I had originally planned to use bracken, but my carefully dried grass, now soaked in a storm, was crying out to be covered. I fixed the long straw thatch with a combination of lashing and twisted hazel spars, and I found that the grass thatch worked well to fix into with the spars, although I imagine turf would have gripped even better. I continued with the same directional thatching method, and found that I was able to thatch the roof in just 3 days, in striking contrast for the 3 weeks it took for the first layer. This really shows the time and labour involved in gathering and transporting of thatching material, compared to actually putting it on the roof. Directional thatching is thinner and less durable, lasting only 5 years as opposed to 30. Often traditionally used for hayricks and barns, I chose this style as it seemed the most likely method that an Anglo-Saxon might have used for their temporary shelters and pit houses, when they needed a quick roof in place for the onset of winter, before building their larger, more permanent houses with more durable thatching styles. Thatching would likely have been the most common form of roof during the Anglo-Saxon period, as it was inexpensive and readily available. The Anglo-Saxons grew ancient varieties of wheat and barley, which stood very tall. In fact, there are medieval records of losing small cows in grain fields. This length made the straw very useful for thatching, and so a field of grain for bread and ale also represented a great source of roof material. Other materials used might have been bracken, water reed or heather, depending on locally available vegetation. Wooden shingles are likely to have been used on some higher status buildings where the extra labour could be afforded. And although the early Anglo-Saxons did not produce their own fired clay roof tiles, some Saxon church buildings may have made use of recycled Roman tiles, recovered from the old Roman cities such as Bath or Aquae Sulis. The most exposed area of a thatched roof is the ridgeline, and it needs to be thatched with a double layer, sometimes also folded over the ridge itself. This stops water from leaking through the top of the ridge and makes it more durable. To help secure the ridgeline, I used heavy logs lashed together with withies to form crosses, which would sit on the ridgeline and hold down the hazel rods. With the roof finished and the walls protected, I could then continue to finish the walls at my ease. I started by finishing the gable ends of the house with more wattle, this time using thinner rods for a better finish. At each end, I left space for a window and a triangular smoke hole. I trimmed the eaves of the roof before starting to daub the wattle walls. Daub, or cob, is a mixture of clay, sand and plant fibre, used as daub to cover wattle walls, or used in its own right as cob walls. I used the earth that I dug up from the pit, as it happily had the right mix of clay and sand. This is one possible and often overlooked reason that pit houses may have been preferred. Digging the pit provides a ready source of earth for building walls where it otherwise would have to be carted in, which is a huge amount of extra effort. I used the waste straw combings from my thatch as a source of fibre, and mixed as much in with the earth as I could, with a little water, until it had a good sticky consistency, just wet enough to stick to the wattle, but not too wet that it would slump or crack too much while drying. I then mixed the cob by trampling it underfoot, turning it and repeating, adding water as needed. In the past, this trampling may have been done on a larger scale with livestock. This had the benefit of adding dung to the mix, which provided a great source of very fine fibre, improving the consistency of the cob. If I had had some livestock at hand, I would definitely have tried this, but it's something I'd really like to try in the future. The daub is applied to the wattle walls, simply pressing it in so it is forced into the gaps between the hazel rods, and then smoothing it off, much like a sort of earthen laven plaster. As the daub dries, the wall becomes a solid mass with great strength. As long as the wall is kept dry, it can last for decades or even centuries if maintained. Some medieval timber frame houses in Britain still have their original lave and daub plaster walls. I also had the daub underneath the thatched eaves, which was really difficult to reach, and I wish I'd daubed that area first before quickly adding the first row of thatching to protect it from the weather. With that, the main structure of the house was finished, and I could breathe for a moment. I really liked the look of the lashed roof crosses, making my house feel like a tiny hay rod with its golden roof. And just in time, as not long after, autumn rolled in. With the outer structure finished, my thoughts turned to the interior of the house and making it more comfortable. Tired of sleeping on a pile of leftover straw, I decided to make a bed. The Anglo-Saxons produced planks by cleaving logs into sections and hewing these down to a finished plank. While I had these planks left over from a previous project, you can watch me split and hew straight planks from a log in my shield making series. There is no evidence whatsoever that the Anglo-Saxons used large timber saws for carpentry. While there has been a couple of very small hacksaws found, these are suitable for bone, metal or fine woodwork, and there has been no other finds of large timber saws. It appears that the Anglo-Saxons were skilled in using axes and chisels to do almost all of their carpentry work. Timbers from early medieval sites such as York, London, Mucking and Ebbsfleet have survived in waterlogged conditions, and many show tool marks from being worked by axes, but none show any saw marks. I sharpened my wrought iron chisel and other tools with some handmade whetstones made of the local sandstone, one a sandy coarse variety, and another finer red-coloured stone. I finished with a fine black sandstone imported from Europe. This would have been quite a luxury item in 7th century Britain, as can be seen by the whetstone sceptre found in the Royal Sutton Hoo ship burial. During the period, mortises were cut with chisels or drilled out first with a spoon auger before cleaning the edges. I use a knotted string to mark out my measurements in inches. This is the mortise for a type of joint known as a tusk tenon, used very often in medieval furniture, where the tenon fits through the mortise and protrudes out of the other side, which is then locked in place with a wedge or peg. My axe is known as a T-shaped hewing axe. Like the axes of the period, it has a wrought iron body with forge-welded steel bit. It is sided, meaning it is asymmetrical and only sharpened on one side, making it well suited for hewing flat surfaces and cutting straight lines. This style of axe was imported to southern Britain as Frankish axe hammers used for war around the 5th century, and developed into a carpentry tool sometime around the late 7th century. All the joints are fitted individually, and so must be marked to identify them with their corresponding partner. I drilled holes for the pegs with a spoon auger, the most common tool for drilling holes in the early medieval period. I then used a smaller spoon auger to drill holes along the entire length of the planks to house the cordage that would form the rope lattice bed. The tarred flaxen cord was passed through each hole and pulled as tight as possible, starting the cords that spanned the width of the bed. The last of the tension was taken up with a wooden wedge. I then passed cord running the length of the bed, each one woven in between the first set, to produce a rope lattice strong enough to hold my weight. This bed is inspired by the late 7th century bed burials, a conversion period style of burial exclusive to high-status female graves occurring in southern Britain. These beds were of a simple plank design, often with iron hooks to hold the ropes. Medieval mattress materials varied from dry hay to wool or goose down. In keeping with a humble pit house, I filled the bed with lots of dry straw and covered it with wool blankets and a sheepskin. I could finally sleep in comfort. My next project was to build a door, and having lots of hazel rods spare, I decided on a temporary design of wattle. I had planned to replace this with a more permanent plank door, but I admit I haven't yet changed it, and I do like the more rustic style for now. Wattle hurdles and panels can easily be made by knocking several stakes into the ground about a pace apart, and then weaving flexible green hazel rods between them, alternating the weave with each rod. From the Neolithic to the 19th century, wattle hurdles were used extensively for everything from movable fences to racks for drying and smoking food. door needed to be arched to fit into the porch entrance of my house, so I pulled the two outer rods into the centre and lashed them into an arch. I then trimmed and pushed the remaining rods into the archway, maintaining the woven pattern. I really liked the contrast between the rustic hazel wattle and the Gothic archway of the door. With winter taking hold and the wet weather setting in, the site around my house became unbearably muddy, especially since I was only wearing medieval turn shoes or going barefoot. I decided to pull some flat sandstone rocks out of the stream to create a stone path out of the mud. The largest of these I set in the entranceway. I noticed chisel marks on this largest stone slab, and I have no idea how it got into my stream, other than perhaps being used as a bridge or fording stone. But I like to think of the craftsman cutting this rock by hand decades or even generations ago, and that being just a tiny part of the heritage of this landscape and this anachronistic little house. Whoever that person was, they have my thanks. It felt very good to raise myself out of the mud. I lashed the door to a simple dug-in post, again using tarred flaxen cord, and the door swung quite happily on its hinges. All that was needed was yet more cob to fill in the gaps and smooth out the entranceway. And, of course, another woolen blanket to block out the drafts, this being perhaps not the most airtight door that was ever made. Some of the 70-year-old hazel which I cut was straight and true enough to cleave into planks, so I set to work making some window shutters. The Anglo-Saxons used this technique with axes and wooden wedges to cleave trees of any size, even over 1 metre in diameter and many metres in length. A great place to see this is the Sutton Hoo Ships Company, or the Viking Ship Museum at Roskilde, where they are building reconstructions of early medieval ships using exactly this method. I have cleaved and hewn trees of this great size firsthand, and by radially splitting huge oaks into quarters, eighths and sixteenths, it is possible to produce some beautifully strong and flexible planks, suitable for the great clinker-built ships of the Germanic and Scandinavian kings. These little logs are nowhere near that scale, but each half gave me a sweet little plank of clear and bright hazelwood. It's uncertain why the Anglo-Saxons did not use large saws to produce planks and beams for building. Saws were certainly used in Roman Britain, and the technology was known to the Saxons. It could be that the bloomery iron available to the Anglo-Saxons may not have been of sufficient quality to produce thin, flexible, large saw blades. But just because axes were preferred doesn't necessarily mean it was an inferior technology. There may have been cultural preferences too. Cleaving trees and hewing planks was integral to Northern European clinker shipbuilding traditions, and these would have heavily influenced other carpentry. Most carpenters may have been so comfortable using axes for precise carpentry that they didn't feel the need to use saws until high-quality trees became scarce in the 13th century. Cleaving even large trees is possible within a few hours. The tree can be split as it lies without needing to move it around, raise it, or even dig a saw pit. It may have been much easier to process these huge trees where they were felled and transport the smaller pieces, rather than digging a saw pit and manoeuvring the tree into a sawable position. With a huge array of high-quality straight trees still available, cleaving would have been relatively easy in the Anglo-Saxon period, and produced strong timber with intact grain all along the plank. The introduction of saw pits to Britain in the later medieval period coincides with a reduction in forests and apparently far less available quality timber. It also coincides with the transition from clinker-built boats with long flexible planks to carvel-built boats with shorter solid planks in Northern Europe. This is potentially also a reflection of the changes in available timber quality. Twisted, knotty timber is far easier to cut with a saw than to cleave, and carvel-built boats may have been adopted in response to having to use poorer quality timber over time. Inspired by early medieval shipbuilding, I decided to add some wooden cleats to my planks, based on the Germanic Nidam ship, which had frames fastened to wooden cleats. The wooden cleats would be useful to tie and secure my window closed from the inside. I decided to join my planks by eye, without straight lines, to save as much of the width of my already narrow planks as possible. By butting each plank together, marking the high spots, and carefully shaving these off, I was able to get a tight but curvy fit to each joint. I don't know if there's a word for this technique, but I like the sound of live edge joinery. The blackthorn copse that surrounds my house comes into bloom each spring, and this year it welcomed my house with a cloud of white blossom. I fixed the window planks together with simple wooden ledges, cut to fit as tightly as possible. I finished by lashing the construction together, again inspired by the Needham ship. As I had cut all of this joinery from fresh green wood, it would inevitably shrink as it dried. I decided to use lashing because it could be easily cut and taken apart, and the construction fixed with wooden pegs once it had dried and seasoned. This means that any gaps that appear from shrinkage can be closed up again in the future. The inside of the house was still bare at this point, with the wattle showing. It needed covering with daub on the inside too. To brighten the interior walls, I painted them with lime wash, a mix of lime slaked in water. My next task was to make an oven, for baking bread and providing some warmth. While Anglo-Saxon ovens were usually a simple clay dome, I decided to try out a different style, based on Romano-British and Anglo-Saxon updraft pottery kilns. Experimental reconstructions of these kilns work similarly to a rocket stove, with the fire fed from below and being drawn up into a firing chamber, covered with a dome of earth, with the exhaust exiting from a flue at the rear of the dome. I thought it could be interesting to try this out in a domestic setting, to see if this concept could be used to produce an efficient oven that would produce less smoke than a traditional medieval oven. I first built the fuel opening and updraft section of the oven, using hazel rods for support and forming the structure from cob bricks. Cob needs support while it is wet, but once dry, it holds its own weight as a solid structure. I then built up around the updraft flue to form a solid block of cob, for good thermal mass and to provide a base for the domed part of the oven. I used willow rods to create a basket-like support structure for the domed clay oven on top. I formed the clay dome first with a thermal layer of gravel-heavy cob. This first layer was indented to provide a key for the second layer of cob to stick to. I cut a hole in the wall to construct a rear outlet flue for this oven. Early medieval houses had no chimneys, and most often had just a central hearth fire. In my house, the high roof allows smoke from the hearth fire to rise into the rafters, where it gathers, before exiting out of the two triangular smoke holes at each end. This is useful, as it creates a low oxygen environment in the rafters, which extinguishes any sparks before they reach the thatch. Actually, I found that sparks rarely make it a couple of feet above the fire, as long as I'm using well-seasoned hazel firewood, and it has always felt relatively safe. That said, it can get smoky inside the house, as the roof is not quite as high as some of the larger Saxon houses and long halls might have been. This highlights just how important the industry around cutting and drying firewood, as well as coppice management, would have been to medieval people. Traditional domed clay ovens can also smoke a lot during lighting, so I decided to create an outlet flue based on Romano-British pottery kilns, so that the smoke could exit through the wall of my house. I finished the domed oven with a second layer of straw cob for insulation. On its first firing, I was happy with the rocket stove effect of the oven, burning cleanly with little smoke. There were also no sparks coming out of the outlet, which reassured me greatly. Because of the domed oven, I believe the sparks hit the top of the dome and extinguish before the exhaust is forced back down to the outlet, exiting as just hot air and smoke. Just a well-fitting clay door was needed to make the oven ready for baking. To bake bread, I mix a simple dough of flour and water, along with some risen dough from the last batch as a yeast starter. From the hilly scrubland near my house, there is a plentiful supply of tinder material. Old man's beer. Thistledown. Old grass and dry bracken fronds. I use these to create a tinder nest and catch a spark on some charcloth with a fire steel. Even on a dry autumn day, the tinder is still slightly damp, and it takes me a second attempt to coax the fire into life. I wonder how many times this ritual has been repeated since the 7th century. It was here, in Somerset, that in the 6th and 7th centuries the ambitious leaders of the USI overthrew the Romano-British kings of the Dumnoni, and took control of the important power centres of Bath and Glastonbury, forcing the Dumnonian elite back, first to the Wansdyke, and then beyond, to the River Parrett. The origins of the USI are shrouded in myth, a line of kings claiming descent from Woden and Germanic ancestry, but with names of British origin, such as Kenwal and Caerdwalla. Whether the kings of the USI were descended from Germanic warlords, or an ambitious Romano-British elite adopting the cultures of their Anglo-Saxon neighbours, we may never truly know. But their fight for power sparked the rise of the kingdom we know today as Wessex. As I prepared this meal, I was aware of all the hard work that surrounded me in the form of this little house. I had spent about 4 months of solid work building it all, over the course of a year. And during that year, I had spent a great amount of time experiencing life as people may have experienced it in the past. I made mistakes, and had to deal with the struggles they brought. This was the wettest winter of many years, and I felt like a fool when my pit house did indeed flood, something I could have avoided if I had just taken some kind advice and heeded the significance of meadowsweet in the pasture. After raising the floor level again and again to create a finally, thankfully dry earthen floor, I learned that most Saxon pit houses have been found on gravel terraces and well-draining sandy soils, not the clay loam of soggy Somerset. Indeed, the Saxon pit house has not yet been found archaeologically in southwest Britain, suggesting that the incoming Saxons used some other method of building, or were influenced by Romano-British styles. Perhaps their smaller buildings were built on wooden sills, alongside the post-built halls of Cadbury and Cheddar. While working on this project, I sewed and wore my own clothes and shoes, based on historical finds, coppiced, cut and stored firewood with just an axe, cleared land, tilled soil, and grew some of my own food, and I was always astounded at the tenacity of our ancestors, some of whom were almost entirely self-sufficient as communities, their skill and perseverance against all the hardships I am lucky enough not to have to face: violence, starvation, sickness. And not only did they survive, they thrived to create beautiful works of art in gold, garnet and illumination, and told tales like Beowulf of ancient heroes, established monasteries where women counselled kings, and built golden halls where poets philosophized on the crumbling ruins of Roman towns. So, no matter how forcefully this modern world forges on in the name of progress, I will always look back and thank our ancestors and the loamy earth to which we will all return.